When you picture the German war machine of the Second World War, you probably picture something terrifying. Panzer tanks rolling across the steppes of Russia, U-boats lurking beneath the Atlantic, cities reduced to rubble by the Luftwaffe. Nazi Germany seemed in those early years of conquest like the most formidable military power the world had ever seen. And yet, here is a question that almost nobody stops to ask. Was Hitler's Germany actually weaker than the Germany that fought the First World War? Was the Reich that conquered France in 6 weeks, that came within miles of Moscow, that held out against virtually the entire industrialized world for nearly 6 years, actually a lesser power than the Kaiser's empire that ground to a halt and collapsed in 1918? The answer, when you dig into the economics, the strategy, the politics, and the sheer industrial muscle of both nations, is a resounding and rather startling yes. In this video, we are going to find out exactly why. We will examine the economy, the military doctrine, the industrial base, the diplomatic alliances, the political structure, and the human cost of both wars. And we will discover that Imperial Germany, for all that it lost its war, was in almost every measurable sense a more rational, more effectively organized, and ultimately more sustainable military power than the Nazi state that followed it. So without further ado, let's start with the first dimension of comparison. To understand why Nazi Germany was weaker than Imperial Germany, you first have to understand what Imperial Germany actually was. The German Empire that went to war in August 1914 was, by almost any measure, the dominant economic and industrial power on the European continent. Since unification under Bismarck in 1871, Germany had undergone an industrial transformation of staggering speed and scale. By 1914, Germany produced more steel than Britain and France combined. Its chemical industry was the most advanced in the world, supplying the global market with dyes, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals. Its electrical industry, led by giants like Siemens and AEG, was at the cutting edge of global technology. German universities produced more scientific doctorates than any other nation on Earth, and German scientific achievement was so dominant that the Nobel Prize Committee awarded a disproportionate share of its early prizes to German and German-speaking researchers. The empire had a population of roughly 67 million people, a well-trained and well-equipped professional army with deep reserves, and a general staff system that was widely regarded as the finest in the world. When Germany went to war in 1914, it did so with allies that controlled significant portions of Central and Southeastern Europe. Austria-Hungary, with its 50 million people, provided a second major front and a vast pool of manpower. The Ottoman Empire, though weakened, controlled strategically vital territory and could threaten British and Russian interests in the Middle East. And Bulgaria, joining the Central Powers in 1915, completed a block of territory that stretched from the North Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia. This was not a coalition of equals, but it was a coherent strategic bloc that controlled interior lines of communication and forced the Entente powers to fight on multiple, widely separated fronts simultaneously. Now compare this to the situation Adolf Hitler inherited when he came to power in January 1933. Germany was prostrate. The Weimar Republic had endured hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of an entire generation, followed by a global depression that had pushed unemployment to nearly 30% of the workforce. The country had been stripped of territory, military capacity, and international standing by the Treaty of Versailles. Its army had been reduced to a rump force of 100,000 men, forbidden from having tanks, aircraft, or submarines. Its industry had been damaged not only by the war, but by the reparations regime that followed it. And yet, within 6 years, Hitler had rebuilt Germany into a military power capable of overrunning Poland, then Denmark, Norway, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, and Greece in rapid succession. This achievement was genuinely remarkable, but it concealed fundamental weaknesses that would prove fatal, weaknesses that the Imperial German state had never suffered to anything like the same degree. The story of why Nazi Germany was weaker begins with money. The economics of the two German wars could hardly have been more different, and in almost every respect, the comparison favors the imperial period. Wilhelmina Germany went into the First World War with an economy that, while not perfectly prepared for the duration and demands of a multi-year industrial conflict, at least had a rational foundation. The German government in 1914 financed the war primarily through domestic borrowing, issuing war bonds to a population that, initially at least, bought them with patriotic fervour. The German mark remained broadly stable through the first 2 years of the war. Industrial mobilization, though slower than it should have been in the first months, accelerated dramatically under the Hindenburg Programme from 1916 onwards, which reorganized the entire German economy for war production on a rational, centrally planned basis. Output of artillery shells, rifles, steel and chemical weapons rose dramatically. The German war economy, for all its eventual failures, operated on a recognizable basis of credits, debts and productive capacity that could be rationally measured and planned. Hitler's war economy was, by contrast, a barely concealed fraud. The rearmament that made Nazi Germany seem so powerful in the 1930s was financed not through taxation or genuine domestic saving, but through a system of financial instruments invented by the economist Hjalmar Schacht, called Mefo bills. These were essentially promissory notes issued by a shell company called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, used to pay arms manufacturers in exchange for military equipment, and guaranteed by the German government, but kept off the official books to disguise the true scale of German rearmament from foreign observers. By 1939, Germany had accumulated vast quantities of hidden debt. The 4-year plan under Hermann Göring had pushed industrial investment toward armaments at the expense of consumer goods, agricultural development, and long-term infrastructure. Germany entered the Second World War with foreign exchange reserves that were, by some estimates, barely sufficient to sustain imports for a few weeks. The country was dependent on imports for a host of strategic raw materials, including oil, rubber, iron ore, and certain metals, and it had no realistic plan for how to obtain these things in a prolonged conflict. Schacht himself, one of the architects of Nazi financial policy, resigned from the Reichsbank presidency in January 1939 precisely because he believed Germany's financial position was dangerously unsustainable. He was right. And so the question you have to ask yourself is this: how could a country that was essentially bankrupt before its major war even began compete with the combined resources of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States? The industrial comparison between the two Germanys is equally revealing. Imperial Germany's industrial base was, as we noted, genuinely world-class. It was also, crucially, efficiently organized and rationally managed by a class of professional industrialists and technical managers who had spent decades building up their expertise. Companies like Krupp, Thyssen, and BASF were not political creatures. They were professionally managed enterprises with deep technical competence, long-term investment strategies, and genuine capacity for expansion and innovation. When the Hindenburg Programme mobilized German industry in 1916 and 1917, it was building on this solid foundation. The result was a genuine surge in war production that, even against the enormous resources of the British Empire and eventually the United States, kept Germany competitive until the very end. Germany in 1918 was not defeated because it ran out of weapons. It was defeated because its political system collapsed, its allies crumbled, its population starved, and its army mutinied. The industrial base, right to the end, was still producing. Nazi Germany's industrial organization was, by contrast, a bureaucratic catastrophe. The Third Reich was not, as it often appeared from the outside, a well-organized totalitarian state that efficiently marshaled its resources for a single purpose. It was in reality a chaos of competing fiefdoms, overlapping jurisdictions, and personal rivalries conducted at a level of institutional dysfunction that would have been comical if the consequences had not been so terrible. Hermann Göring's 4-year plan competed with the economics ministry under Walter Funk. The SS had its own economic empire, running slave labor enterprises that produced at grotesquely inefficient rates. The Todt organization built roads and fortifications under a separate command structure. The Army, Navy, and Air Force each had their own procurement systems that frequently worked at cross purposes and duplicated effort on a massive scale. Hitler himself intervened constantly and erratically in economic decisions, vetoing sensible proposals, favouring personal cronies, and making strategic choices based on ideology rather than rational calculation. The result was an economy that, despite Germany's genuine industrial potential, consistently underperformed relative to what it was theoretically capable of producing. The most damning illustration of this failure is the comparison with how other countries mobilise their female labour forces for war production. In Britain, women were conscripted for industrial work on a large scale from 1941 onwards. In the Soviet Union, women operated machine tools, assembled tanks, flew combat aircraft, and served as snipers. In the United States, the figure of Rosie the Riveter became an iconic representation of female industrial participation. In Nazi Germany, the mobilization of women for war work was systematically resisted for ideological reasons. The Nazi conception of women as mothers and homemakers, encapsulated in the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, meant that Germany failed to exploit one of its most obvious sources of additional labour at precisely the moment when it needed every pair of hands it could find. Instead, the regime turned to forced labour, importing millions of workers from occupied territories, a system that was not only morally monstrous but also economically inefficient, since slave labourers forced to work in brutal conditions under constant threat of violence produce far less than free workers motivated by wages and working under humane conditions. Albert Speer, who became armaments minister in 1942 and who achieved genuine improvements in German war production through rationalization and consolidation, estimated that Germany had wasted years of potential output through this institutional dysfunction. And here is something that might genuinely surprise you. Britain, with a smaller population and a similar industrial base to Germany, outproduced Germany in aircraft, one of the most technically demanding manufacturing challenges of the war, in almost every year of the conflict until Speer's reforms began to take effect in 1943. The military doctrines of the two Germanys present another fascinating and revealing comparison. Imperial Germany's military thinking, while deeply flawed in certain respects, was at least the product of a coherent strategic tradition. The German General Staff had been refining its approach to warfare since the days of Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, the genius who had orchestrated Prussia's victories over Austria in 1866 and France in 1870 and 1871. The system that evolved from these campaigns emphasized Auftragstaktik, a command philosophy that delegated decision-making authority to the lowest practical level, trusting junior officers to use their initiative within the framework of their commander's overall intentions. German officers were trained to think, to adapt, and to act independently when communication with higher command broke down. This approach produced an army of remarkable tactical flexibility. The stormtrooper tactics developed by men like Oskar von Hutier in the latter years of the First World War, the doctrine of infiltration and exploitation of weak points that bypassed enemy strong points, rather than battering through them, represented a genuine revolution in military thinking that influenced armies all over the world for decades. When the German army achieved its breakthrough on the Western Front in March 1918, driving 50 miles into Allied territory and bringing the war closer to a German victory than at any point since 1914, it did so using tactics developed and refined within a professional military culture that genuinely respected expertise and learned from experience. The Wehrmacht of Hitler's Germany inherited many of the best features of this tradition. The blitzkrieg tactics that overran Poland in September 1939 and France in May and June 1940 were direct descendants of the Hutier infiltration doctrine, adapted for the era of tanks and aircraft. Erwin Rommel in North Africa, Heinz Guderian in France and Russia, Erich von Manstein in the sweep around the Maginot Line, and in the counter-offensive at Kharkov in 1943, these were officers operating within a tradition of flexible, initiative-based command that was genuinely superior to the doctrine of most of their opponents. And yet, and here is the crucial distinction, the Wehrmacht operated under a political commander-in-chief who progressively strangled the very qualities that made it effective. Adolf Hitler's increasing interference in military operations, which began as early as the Winter Campaign of 1941 to 1942 and accelerated to the point of total control by 1943 and 1944, systematically dismantled the Auftragstaktik tradition that made the German army so formidable. Where Imperial Germany's supreme commanders, men like Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, whatever their other faults, at least deferred to professional military expertise on operational questions, Hitler dismissed, overruled, and eventually replaced virtually every senior officer who gave him advice he did not want to hear. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, was dismissed in December 1941 after the failure before Moscow, with Hitler taking personal command of the army in addition to his roles as head of state and head of government. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was removed twice. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed and reinstated 3 times. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely regarded as Germany's finest operational commander of the war, was dismissed in March 1944 after Hitler finally lost patience with his insistence on the need for flexible defense. By the final year of the war, Hitler was making decisions at divisional level from his underground bunker in Berlin, ordering units to hold positions that no longer existed, refusing to authorize retreats that might have preserved forces for subsequent operations, and dismissing anyone who told him that the strategic situation was hopeless. Compare this to the situation within Imperial Germany's military command structure. The relationship between the Kaiser and his generals was not without friction. Wilhelm II was erratic, vain, and prone to dramatic pronouncements that occasionally interfered with strategic planning, but he was not, in any meaningful sense, a hands-on military commander. The effective direction of Germany's war effort in the critical years of 1916 to 1918 was in the hands of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the team that had made their reputations at the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, where they had encircled and destroyed a Russian army of over 90,000 men in one of the most complete tactical victories of the entire war. These men were professionals. They made mistakes, serious ones, including the decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, which brought the United States into the war. But they made their decisions on the basis of professional military analysis, not ideological obsession or personal vanity. The German army of 1914 to 1918 was commanded by men who, whatever their political views, understood that the fundamental purpose of military force was to achieve strategic objectives at acceptable cost, and they attempted, with varying degrees of success, to pursue that purpose rationally. Hitler's approach to military command was almost the precise opposite. He had served as a corporal in the First World War and had emerged from that experience with a genuine, if simplistic, understanding of what it felt like to be a frontline soldier. He believed, not entirely without foundation, that this experience gave him an insight into the psychology of combat that professional officers lacked. But he extended this into a comprehensive and catastrophically wrong-headed theory of will as the decisive factor in warfare, a belief that sufficient determination could overcome any material disadvantage. This theory led directly to some of the worst strategic decisions of the entire war. The insistence on holding Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943, when a breakout by the Sixth Army might have saved over 300,000 men, was a direct consequence of Hitler's belief that yielding ground was equivalent to psychological defeat, regardless of the tactical or operational situation. The refusal to authorize the development and deployment of a strategic reserve for the anticipated Allied invasion of Western Europe in 1944, preferring instead to hold troops in forward positions where they could be destroyed by Allied air power before they could even engage the enemy, reflected the same inability to think in terms of operational flexibility. And the insistence on designating dozens of German cities and towns as Festungen, fortresses to be held to the last in the final year of the war, resulted in the unnecessary destruction of places that could have been surrendered intact, and the pointless deaths of soldiers and civilians who had nothing left to fight for. The question of strategic decision-making leads directly to the question of war aims, and here again the comparison between the two Germanys reveals fundamental weaknesses in the Nazi state that its imperial predecessor did not share. What exactly was Imperial Germany fighting for in the First World War? The answer even now remains somewhat contested among historians, but the broad outlines are clear enough. Germany wanted security on its eastern border, achieved through the subordination or partition of Russia and the creation of a buffer zone of client states. It wanted colonial revision, the acquisition of overseas territories that would give it the kind of global presence that Britain and France enjoyed. It wanted freedom of the seas, meaning the removal of British naval dominance that could strangle German trade in a prolonged conflict. And it wanted recognition as a great power entitled to a proportionate voice in global affairs. These were, in the broad sweep of 19th and early 20th century, great power politics, recognizable if aggressive objectives. They were the kind of aims that had motivated every major power in Europe for the previous century. And they were aims that, in principle, could have been achieved through negotiated settlement without the complete annihilation of any opposing power. In fact, at various points during the war, particularly in 1917, there were serious discussions between German and Allied governments through neutral intermediaries about the possibility of a negotiated peace. These discussions ultimately came to nothing, but they were not inherently absurd because Germany's war aims, whatever else you might say about them, were at least the kind of territorial and political objectives that could in theory be traded against Allied concessions. Hitler's war aims were of a fundamentally different character. The ideological program set out in Mein Kampf and elaborated in the so-called Second Book, written in 1928 but not published during Hitler's lifetime, called not merely for territorial revision, but for the racial reorganization of Eastern Europe on a biological basis. The Slavic peoples of Poland, the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and the Baltic states were to be partially exterminated, partially enslaved, and partially expelled to make room for German colonists in a continental empire stretching to the Ural Mountains. The Jewish people of Europe were to be eliminated entirely, an aim that the Nazi government began pursuing systematically from 1941 onwards through what became known as the Holocaust. These were not the kind of war aims that could be achieved through negotiated settlement, because they required not the defeat of opposing powers but the destruction of entire peoples, and they ensured that Germany's opponents, particularly the Soviet Union, would fight to the last rather than accept any terms that left the Nazi regime in power. The ideological character of Hitler's war aims thus made a negotiated exit from the conflict essentially impossible in a way that was never true of the First World War, where a Germany that was losing could at least in theory have sued for peace on terms that left the German state and people intact. The alliance structures of the two German wars offer yet another dimension of comparison, and again the verdict favours the Imperial period. When Germany went to war in 1914, its principal ally was Austria-Hungary, the dual monarchy that controlled much of Central and Southeastern Europe. Austria-Hungary was a genuinely substantial power, with a population of around 50 million people, a functioning industrial base, and a military capable of sustaining major operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, even if its armies frequently required German stiffening and German officers to coordinate their efforts. Effectively, the Ottoman Empire, while no longer the formidable power of earlier centuries, controlled territory of genuine strategic significance and possessed a military that, under German training and with German equipment, proved capable of defeating Allied forces at Gallipoli in 1915 and 1916, and holding out against the British in Mesopotamia for considerably longer than anyone had anticipated. Bulgaria, though a smaller player, controlled territory that closed the overland route between the Allied powers and Serbia, and its army performed competently in the Balkan theatre. Taken together, the Central Powers represented a contiguous block of territory, a genuine industrial and military coalition, not a collection of equals certainly, but a meaningful alliance system with real strategic depth. Hitler's alliance partners were, by comparison, almost grotesquely inadequate. Italy had been Germany's ally in theory through the Tripartite Pact signed in September 1940, but Benito Mussolini's decision to enter the war in June 1940, when France was already collapsing and German victory seemed assured, was made with the opportunistic calculation of a man who expected to collect colonial spoils without doing serious fighting. The Italian military performance in the subsequent years was so consistently poor that it became a source of active embarrassment to the German High Command. Italian forces had to be rescued in North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps spent much of its energy compensating for Italian failures. Italian forces had to be rescued in Greece, where Mussolini's ill-judged invasion in October 1940 turned into a humiliating reverse that forced Hitler to divert forces into the Balkans to bail out his ally, consuming time and resources that would prove critical when the invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941. And when Italy collapsed following the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943, Germany was forced to occupy its own allies' territory to prevent the peninsula from falling to the Allies, tying down divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. The collapse of Italy in 1943 was not merely a diplomatic setback. It was a strategic catastrophe that opened a major front in southern Europe and forced Germany to defend a peninsula several hundred miles long, with forces it could ill afford to spare. Japan, the other major Axis partner, fought an entirely separate war in the Pacific and East Asia. Unlike Austria-Hungary, which had actually coordinated military operations with Germany on shared fronts, Japan never cooperated with Germany on any significant military endeavour. Japan did not attack the Soviet Union in 1941, even at Germany's urgent request at the moment when the Wehrmacht was driving toward Moscow. Japan's entry into the war against the United States in December 1941, whatever its strategic logic from a Japanese perspective, had the effect of bringing the enormous industrial power of the United States formally into the European war, without providing Germany with any corresponding military benefit. And when the tide turned against Japan in 1942 and 1943, there was nothing Germany could do to help, and nothing Japan could do to relieve pressure on Germany. Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Finland and Croatia all contributed forces to the Eastern Front, providing Germany with additional manpower for the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. But these forces were of variable quality, inadequately equipped relative to the demands of modern warfare, and liable to collapse under serious Soviet pressure, as the Romanian and Hungarian armies catastrophically demonstrated at Stalingrad in November 1942, when Soviet Operation Uranus destroyed them as coherent fighting forces and encircled the Sixth Army. Would you have predicted, looking at Germany's alliance structure in 1939, that it would prove less strategically valuable than the Central Powers of 1914? Most people would not, but the evidence is, in retrospect, overwhelming. The naval dimension of the comparison reveals further weaknesses in Hitler's strategic position. Imperial Germany built, at enormous expense and over more than 15 years, a battle fleet that was the second largest in the world. The High Seas Fleet, as it was called, challenged British naval supremacy in a way that genuinely alarmed the Royal Navy and forced Britain to maintain its own massive capital ship programme at vast cost. The Battle of Jutland in May and June 1916, the largest naval engagement in the entire war, resulted in higher British losses than German ones, though the strategic outcome was inconclusive, with the German fleet returning to port and never again emerging in force. The German Navy also pioneered effective submarine warfare, and the U-boat campaign of 1917 came genuinely close to severing Britain's Atlantic supply lines before the adoption of the convoy system turned the tide. The point is not that Imperial Germany won the naval war. It did not. The point is that it mounted a serious challenge to British naval dominance that tied down enormous British resources and influenced the entire strategic character of the conflict. Hitler's navy was, by any objective measure, an afterthought. The Z-plan, drawn up by Admiral Erich Raeder in 1939, had envisaged the construction of a massive balanced fleet of battleships, aircraft carriers and supporting vessels that would have been capable of challenging British sea power. But Hitler launched the war years before this fleet could be built. At the outbreak of war, Germany had 2 operational battleships, 2 battlecruisers and 27 ocean-going submarines. This was not a fleet capable of contesting control of the Atlantic. The surface raider campaign, conducted by vessels like the Bismarck, the Graf Spee and the Gneisenau, was tactically disruptive but strategically negligible. The U-boat campaign under Admiral Karl Dönitz was far more dangerous, and in the terrible year of 1942, German submarines sank Allied shipping at a rate that genuinely threatened Britain's ability to sustain itself. But the Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately lost to a combination of improved Allied convoy tactics, airborne radar, long-range patrol aircraft, and the breaking of the German naval Enigma codes, a defeat that reflected the fundamental asymmetry in industrial and technological resources between Germany and its opponents. Germany was never going to win a sustained industrial war at sea against a combination of British, American, and Canadian naval and industrial power. Imperial Germany, with a much more serious surface fleet and a head start in submarine development, came closer. The question of technology is one area where people most often assume Nazi Germany had a decisive advantage over its imperial predecessor, and it is true that the weapons of the Second World War were more sophisticated than those of the First. But sophistication and military effectiveness are not the same thing, and when you look at how Germany's technological programs were managed in the Nazi period, what you find is a story of extraordinary individual achievement, squandered by institutional dysfunction, ideological prejudice, and catastrophic failures of strategic priority. Consider the jet aircraft program. Germany had jet-powered aircraft ready for operational deployment in 1943, at least a year before Britain and America. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could have provided the Luftwaffe with a significant advantage in the air war over Germany if it had been deployed immediately as a fighter interceptor to defend German cities and industrial plants from Allied bombing. Instead, Hitler insisted that it be converted into a bomber to deliver retaliatory strikes against Allied territory, a decision that delayed its operational deployment, resulted in modifications that reduced its performance, and ultimately meant that it arrived in service far too late and in far too few numbers to affect the outcome of the air war. The Me 262 destroyed far more Allied aircraft in its short operational life than any other German fighter of the period, and it represented a genuine technological leap. But the manner of its deployment illustrated precisely how Hitler's personal intervention in military technical decisions consistently undermined Germany's actual capabilities. The V-weapon program, encompassing the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile, offers perhaps the starkest illustration of Nazi Germany's tendency to invest enormous resources in spectacular but strategically marginal technologies, while neglecting more immediately useful ones. The V-2, which was the world's first operational ballistic missile, was a genuinely revolutionary weapon. It was also, in the context of the Second World War, essentially useless. The V-2 could carry roughly 1 ton of high explosive at supersonic speed to a target at ranges of up to 300 kilometers. It was completely unstoppable once launched and utterly inaccurate, arriving within a radius of several kilometers of its intended target at best. The combined V-1 and V-2 offensive against Britain and later Belgium killed around 9,000 people and caused widespread damage and disruption, but it had no effect whatsoever on Allied military operations or industrial output. By contrast, the resources consumed by the V-weapon program, including the vast underground factory at Mittelwerk, where V-2 rockets were assembled by slave laborers under conditions of such brutality that more people died building the rockets than were killed by them, could have produced several thousand additional fighter aircraft or U-boats, weapons that might have made a genuine difference to the outcome of the war. The German physicist and Nobel laureate Werner Heisenberg, who led Germany's nuclear research program, later claimed that he and his colleagues had deliberately slowed the program for moral reasons. This claim is contested by historians, but what is beyond dispute is that Germany's nuclear program was years behind those of the United States and Britain by the end of the war, partly because the Nazi persecution of Jewish scientists had deprived Germany of some of its most brilliant physicists, including Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and dozens of others who emigrated to America and contributed their expertise to the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. In this respect, the ideological character of the Nazi regime actively damaged Germany's technological potential in a way that had no parallel in the Imperial period. Imperial Germany's technological performance in the First World War was, by contrast, genuinely impressive and better integrated with strategic requirements. German chemistry, building on the extraordinary pre-war strength of the German dye industry, produced the poison gas weapons that, when first deployed at Ypres in April 1915, gave Germany a temporary tactical advantage that took the Allies months to overcome. The same chemical industry, critically, solved the problem of nitrogen fixation for explosive production through the Haber-Bosch process, ensuring that Germany could produce sufficient explosives despite the Allied naval blockade that cut off imports of Chilean saltpeter. This was not a glamorous achievement, but it was a genuinely strategic one. Without it, Germany might have run out of explosives within a year or two of the war's beginning. German optical technology, which produced the finest military binoculars, rangefinders, and gun sights in the world, gave German artillery and naval gunners a consistent accuracy advantage over their opponents. And German submarine technology, while not without problems, produced operational vessels of genuine effectiveness that were adapted and improved throughout the war in response to Allied countermeasures, representing exactly the kind of iterative, learning-based technological development that military organizations need to sustain. Compare this to the catastrophic decision, made under Nazi economic policy, to prioritize the production of a small number of extremely expensive and complex tank types, like the Tiger and Panther, over larger numbers of simpler, more reliable vehicles. Germany's inability to standardize its tank production led to a situation where, by 1944, the Wehrmacht was operating dozens of different vehicle types requiring different spare parts, different tools, different maintenance procedures, and different training, creating a logistical nightmare that made it extremely difficult to keep any substantial proportion of the tank force operational at any given time. The Soviet Union, by contrast, standardized on a small number of proven types, particularly the T-34, and produced them in vast quantities at a cost and a rate that Germany could never match. The political structure of the two German states represents perhaps the most fundamental point of comparison, and it is the one that most directly explains the difference in their strategic effectiveness. Imperial Germany was, by the standards of its time, a functioning constitutional monarchy with a professional civil service, an independent judiciary, a freely elected parliament, and a tradition of civic and legal order that, whatever its limitations, at least provided a framework within which rational decisions could be made and implemented through established institutional processes. The Prussian civil service tradition that underpinned the Imperial German state was one of the most professionally competent administrative systems in the world. German bureaucracy, famous for its thoroughness and its attention to procedure, might sometimes be slow and inflexible, but it was reliably honest, technically expert, and capable of managing complex undertakings over long time periods. When the imperial government needed to mobilize the German economy for war, it worked through this professional bureaucratic apparatus to create bodies like the War Raw Materials Department under Walter Rathenau, a brilliant industrialist who developed systems for allocating scarce resources that provided a rational, if imperfect, basis for economic management in conditions of severe scarcity. The Imperial German state, for all its authoritarianism, operated according to laws and procedures that had been built up over decades and that were, in general, followed by those who administered them. The Nazi state was something entirely different. Adolf Hitler had no interest in, and no patience for, the kind of bureaucratic regularity that the imperial system embodied. His governing style, which his biographer Ian Kershaw has described as working towards the Führer, meant that the various agencies and departments of the Nazi state competed constantly for Hitler's favour, each trying to interpret and anticipate his wishes in order to secure resources and expand their institutional power. This system produced not efficient government, but a permanent state of institutional conflict that consumed enormous energy and produced decisions of frequently catastrophic quality. Heinrich Himmler's SS empire, which by the end of the war encompassed its own military forces, its own industrial enterprises, its own agricultural operations, its own intelligence services, and its own system of concentration and extermination camps, operated largely outside the regular structures of government and in constant competition with the Wehrmacht, the Foreign Office, the Economics Ministry, and virtually every other arm of the state. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and the head of the party chancellery, controlled access to Hitler and used this position to build an administrative empire of his own that functioned in parallel with and in constant friction against the regular government apparatus. Albert Speer, the armaments minister whose rationalization of German war production genuinely increased output from 1942 onwards, spent much of his energy fighting bureaucratic battles against Himmler, Göring, Fritz Sauckel, and half a dozen other Nazi potentates who controlled resources he needed. This was not a rational way to run a war economy. It was not even a rational way to run a large organization of any kind. It was the inevitable result of a political system built not around institutional competence, but around personal loyalty to a single leader whose judgment was, on any objective assessment, increasingly deranged by the end of the war. How does this political comparison translate into concrete military outcomes? Consider the question of intelligence. Imperial Germany had a functioning military intelligence service that, while not as sophisticated as some of its counterparts in the Second World War era, provided professional assessments of enemy capabilities that were generally taken seriously by the military command. Germany's analysis of Russian capabilities in 1914, while not perfect, was broadly realistic about the military balance and did not systematically distort intelligence to match preconceived conclusions. Nazi Germany's intelligence failures were of a different order entirely. The most famous is the catastrophic underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity that contributed to the decision to launch Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, with the expectation that the Soviet Union would collapse within 3 to 5 months. German military planners genuinely believed, based on assessments shaped more by racial ideology than by professional analysis, that the Red Army was so degraded by Stalin's purges and so inherently inferior as a fighting force that it would be unable to sustain the kind of defensive recovery that it in fact mounted with extraordinary effectiveness. The actual industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, including the transfer of entire factory complexes from threatened western regions to the safety of Siberia and the Ural Mountains, was consistently underestimated. The determination of the Soviet population to resist, which was in large part a direct consequence of the brutality with which the Germans treated Soviet prisoners and civilians, was never seriously modelled. And the ability of the United States to supply the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease with trucks, locomotives, telephone wire, canned food, and thousands of other essential items that freed Soviet industry to concentrate on tanks and aircraft was simply not factored into German strategic planning. These were not merely military errors. They were the predictable consequences of a political system that punished bearers of unwelcome news and rewarded those who told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The comparison of population and manpower policies between the two German wars is equally revealing. Imperial Germany mobilized approximately 13.5 million men for military service during the First World War, out of a population of roughly 67 million. This represented a total mobilization rate of around 20%, achieved through a conscription system that was efficient, well organized, and drew on decades of military preparation. The replacement and training systems that fed new soldiers into the front lines were professional and largely adequate to the task, though the losses of the war, particularly the terrible battles of the Somme and Verdun in 1916, eventually strained them severely. Imperial Germany also, crucially, managed to feed its population through most of the war, despite the Allied naval blockade, through a combination of rationing, agricultural reorganization, and the exploitation of occupied territories. The famous turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, when the failure of the potato harvest forced Germans to subsist partly on turnips, was genuinely terrible and had severe effects on morale and public health. But it did not produce mass starvation on the scale that might have been expected. Germany's population, while suffering genuine hardship, remained broadly capable of sustained industrial and agricultural effort through to 1918, when the combination of accumulated hunger, influenza, and military despair finally broke the home front. Nazi Germany's manpower management was, once again, a story of ideological interference undermining rational policy. The refusal to mobilize women, as we have noted, represented a massive self-imposed limitation on the available labor force. The decision to eliminate the Jewish population of Europe, begun in earnest in 1941 and completed by 1945, destroyed a community that included doctors, scientists, engineers, accountants, teachers, and skilled workers of every description, at precisely the moment when Germany needed every skilled individual it could find. The persecution and murder of the handicapped, the mentally ill, homosexuals, Roma, and other targeted groups removed additional individuals from the productive workforce, and the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, of whom approximately 3.5 million died in German captivity during the first year of the war alone, largely through deliberate starvation and exposure, deprived Germany of a vast pool of potential forced labour at a time when it was desperately short of workers, only to reverse course later and begin employing Soviet POWs as workers after the strategic situation had changed. The total number of foreign workers employed in the German war economy by 1944 reached approximately 7.5 million, a figure that illustrates the desperate nature of Germany's labour shortage. But the productivity of these workers, many of them brutally exploited, poorly fed, and operating under constant threat of violence, was far below what their numbers might suggest. The question of raw material supply is one of the most fundamental determinants of military effectiveness in an industrialized war, and on this question the comparison between Imperial and Nazi Germany is particularly stark. Imperial Germany, for all its industrial strength, was genuinely dependent on imports for certain critical materials, particularly Chilean saltpetre for explosives production, as we have mentioned, and certain tropical agricultural products. The Allied naval blockade, which progressively tightened from 1914 onwards, cut Germany off from most of these imports and created genuine shortages that affected military production throughout the war. But Germany in 1914 had advantages that Hitler's Germany lacked. It had substantial domestic coal reserves, sufficient to power its industry and generate electricity for its factories throughout the war. It had enough domestic iron ore production, supplemented by ore from Sweden, that arrived through the Baltic until late in the war, to sustain steel production at useful levels. Its chemical industry was, as noted, capable of producing synthetic substitutes for many natural products, and the scientific and industrial expertise to develop these substitutes was the best in the world. Germany's food supply, while strained by the blockade, was supported by the agricultural output of occupied Belgium, northern France, and eventually Romania and Ukraine, which were under German control by 1918. The war ended before food shortages became truly catastrophic for the German civilian population. Though they were certainly serious, Hitler's Germany faced a material situation that was, in many respects, more precarious than that of 1914. The most critical shortage was oil. Germany had essentially no domestic petroleum production of any significance. In 1939, it was dependent on imports from Romania and the Soviet Union for most of its oil requirements. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 cut off the Soviet oil supply, while the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, though they fell within the German sphere of influence, were insufficient to meet the Wehrmacht's needs. Germany pursued two strategies to address this shortage: the conquest of the Soviet Caucasian oil fields, which was one of the primary strategic objectives of the 1942 summer offensive, and the development of synthetic oil production from coal through the hydrogenation processes developed by the chemical company IG Farben. The synthetic oil plants located at sites like Luna, Blechhammer and Berlin became critical choke points in the German war economy. When Allied strategic bombing finally focused on these plants in the spring and summer of 1944, the effect on German military operations was immediate and severe. Luftwaffe pilot training was curtailed because fuel was unavailable. Panzer units were immobilized by lack of fuel. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, Hitler's last major counterattack in the West, was planned partly on the assumption that German forces would be able to capture Allied fuel dumps and use them to sustain the advance. They did not, and the offensive consumed irreplaceable fuel reserves that Germany could not replace. Imperial Germany never faced an oil crisis of this severity, because the mechanization of warfare in 1914 to 1918, while significant, had not yet reached the total dependence on petroleum products that characterized the Second World War's armored and air forces. Rubber was another critical material of which Germany had no domestic supply. In the First World War, the relatively small requirement for rubber in military vehicles was met partly from pre-war stockpiles and partly from synthetic production, but the quantities required were manageable. In the Second World War, Germany's mechanized army required vast quantities of rubber for tires, seals, gaskets, and 100 other applications. The Allied naval blockade cut off access to natural rubber from Southeast Asia. Synthetic rubber, known as Buna, was produced by IG Farben at a plant at Monowitz, which was itself adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex and relied on slave labor. Production never fully met demand. German trucks and tanks frequently operated with recapped tires of dubious quality, and rubber shortages consistently limited the mobility and reliability of German mechanized forces. Here again, the comparison with Imperial Germany is instructive. The Kaiser's army, fighting a war whose equipment requirements were in many ways less demanding than those of the Second World War, was at least not facing the specific vulnerability of total dependence on a strategic material it could not produce and could not import in sufficient quantities. The food situation in Nazi Germany followed a similar pattern of initial advantage giving way to progressive deterioration. In the early years of the war, the German civilian population was actually fed rather well by wartime standards, a deliberate political choice by the Nazi leadership, who feared a repetition of the home front collapse that had contributed to Germany's defeat in 1918. The agricultural surplus of occupied Europe, extracted through a combination of outright looting and coercive trade at artificial exchange rates, supplemented German domestic production sufficiently that rationing, while present, was not initially severe by the standards of the previous war. But as the war extended and the occupied territories were increasingly stripped of their resources, and as Allied bombing disrupted the transport networks on which German food distribution depended, conditions deteriorated sharply. By the final year of the war, caloric intake in Germany's cities had fallen to levels that were genuinely threatening to public health, and the population of Germany's occupied territories was in many places experiencing outright famine. The 2 or 3 million Soviet civilians who died from hunger and related causes in German-occupied territory during the war, a figure separate from the Holocaust and the deliberate murder of POWs, represents one of the darkest chapters of the entire conflict. And unlike the suffering of Imperial Germany's population in the First World War, which was the largely unintended consequence of an effective naval blockade, the suffering of occupied populations in the Second World War was in many cases the direct result of deliberate German policy, a policy of extracting food for German consumption, regardless of the consequences for local populations. The comparison between the two Germanys extends to the crucial question of intelligence and counterintelligence. Imperial Germany's intelligence services, while not faultless, were generally professional organizations operating within recognizable institutional frameworks. Military intelligence assessed enemy capabilities with reasonable accuracy, and the German code-breaking organization achieved some notable successes during the war. More importantly, Germany's own codes and ciphers were broadly secure for most of the conflict, meaning that the Allies did not, in general, have access to German operational communications. The famous Room 40 at the British Admiralty did crack certain German naval codes, and its most famous success was the Zimmermann Telegram of 1917, in which Germany invited Mexico to attack the United States in exchange for help recovering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, a message whose interception and disclosure helped precipitate American entry into the war. But these were specific successes against specific systems, not a wholesale compromise of German operational security. By contrast, the British and American breaking of the German Enigma codes in the Second World War, achieved at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire by a team that included the mathematician Alan Turing, provided the Allies with access to a large proportion of German military, naval, and air force communications throughout the war. The intelligence derived from this source, codenamed Ultra, contributed to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, the defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the preparation for the D-Day landings, and dozens of other critical operations. Germany never suspected that Enigma had been broken. Its faith in the security of its communications was total, and that faith was entirely misplaced. The Allies knew where German supply convoys were sailing, where German submarines were operating, what German forces were deployed where, and what Hitler and his commanders were planning, in real time and throughout the war. This asymmetry in intelligence capability was one of the most significant single advantages that the Allies possessed, and it was an asymmetry that Imperial Germany had never faced. The demographic and sociological dimensions of the comparison deserve attention, because they reveal something fundamental about the nature of both wars and both German states. Imperial Germany fought the First World War as a nation more or less intact, in the sense that its political community, however stratified by class and religion, was broadly unified in its sense of national identity and its stake in the outcome of the conflict. German workers, German Catholic and Protestant clergy, German Social Democrats, German aristocrats, all of these groups, whatever their differences, shared a sense of belonging to the German nation and a basic interest in German survival as a sovereign state. The Social Democratic Party, which might have been expected to oppose an imperialist war on internationalist principles, voted in the Reichstag for war credits in August 1914 with near unanimity, a decision that split the Second International and produced one of the most famous denunciations in modern political history from Karl Liebknecht, who finally voted against war credits in December 1914 and was subsequently imprisoned. Even the most ardent opponents of the war within Germany were, with very few exceptions, Germans who disagreed with their government's policy rather than people who were excluded from German political community altogether. The war was fought, in other words, within and for a recognizable national community with a shared sense of purpose, however frayed that sense of purpose eventually became under the strains of 4 years of attritional conflict. Nazi Germany's social situation was radically different. The regime had, from its very beginning, defined German national identity in racial terms that excluded hundreds of thousands of people who had previously considered themselves Germans. Jewish Germans, Roma Germans, Afro-Germans and others were stripped of citizenship by the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 and progressively excluded from economic and social life before being subjected to systematic murder from 1941 onwards. German communists, social democrats, trade unionists and other political opponents of the regime were imprisoned in concentration camps, forced into exile, or murdered. The Roman Catholic and Protestant churches, while they largely accommodated themselves to the Nazi state, were subjected to constant pressure and surveillance that created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion in religious communities that had previously been important sources of social cohesion. The result was a society that was, at least in its publicly visible behaviour, fanatically loyal to the regime, but that harboured large populations of people who had every reason to resist, flee, or at minimum withhold their best efforts from a state that had identified them as enemies. The efficiency costs of this social fragmentation are difficult to quantify precisely, but they were certainly real. The scientists and engineers who fled Nazi Germany and ended up working for the Allies represent only the most dramatically measurable category of human capital lost to ideological persecution. The morale comparison between the two wars is also illuminating. Imperial Germany in 1914 fought with genuine popular enthusiasm, at least in its initial phases. The concept of the Burgfrieden, the political truce under which Germany's sharply divided political parties agreed to set aside their differences for the duration of the war, reflected a real, if temporary, sense of national solidarity. Soldiers went to war in August 1914 with something approaching genuine belief in the justice and necessity of their cause, a belief fostered by decades of nationalist education but not entirely manufactured. That enthusiasm inevitably dissipated as the casualty lists lengthened and the promised victory receded into an indefinite future. By 1916, German soldiers on the Western Front were writing letters home that expressed exhaustion and disillusionment rather than patriotic fervour. By 1917 and 1918, the combination of military failure, hunger, influenza, and the visible example of the Russian Revolution was producing a crisis of morale that, combined with the military reverses of the summer and autumn of 1918, ultimately brought the German home front to collapse. But the point is that the collapse came after 4 years of genuine, if increasingly reluctant, popular effort. Germany in the First World War was not sustained by terror. It was sustained until it wasn't by a broadly shared sense of national identification with the war effort. Nazi Germany's morale management relied far more heavily on coercion. The apparatus of the Gestapo, the SD intelligence service, the concentration camps, and the regime's system of informers created a society in which the expression of dissent was genuinely dangerous. People who expressed doubts about German victory, made defeatist remarks, listened to foreign radio broadcasts, or otherwise deviated from the expected norm of fanatical confidence, risked denunciation, arrest, and imprisonment. In the final years of the war, the penalty for certain categories of defeatist behaviour escalated to execution. The flying courts-martial operated by the SS in the last weeks of the war hanged and shot thousands of German soldiers and civilians for desertion or unauthorised retreat, frequently from trees and lampposts in German towns and cities as a public warning to others. This reliance on terror to sustain military and civilian morale reflected the regime's accurate perception that genuine popular enthusiasm for the war, while real enough in the early years of German victory, had largely dissipated by 1943 and had been replaced by a combination of habit, fear, and the absence of any visible alternative. Imperial Germany in 1918 collapsed partly because it lost the will to continue fighting, a genuine popular and military rebellion against the costs of the war. Nazi Germany in 1945 continued fighting in the face of catastrophically hopeless odds, partly because the regime terrorized its own population into compliance, prolonging the war and the suffering for months beyond any point at which continued resistance could have served any rational military or political purpose. The comparison of how the two German states handled the transition from peacetime to wartime economy offers yet another revealing illustration of the underlying structural differences. When Imperial Germany went to war in August 1914, the Reichsbank immediately suspended the convertibility of the mark to gold, a standard wartime measure that allowed the government to finance military spending without being constrained by its gold reserves. The subsequent war finance system, while imperfect, operated through recognizable mechanisms of taxation, domestic borrowing, and money creation that allowed rational assessment of Germany's fiscal position. The government did not, in general, disguise the true cost of the war from those responsible for managing the economy, even if it minimized the costs in its public communications. This transparency, relative to what came later, meant that decision-makers had at least approximately accurate information about what Germany could afford and for how long. Nazi Germany's pre-war economic management, as we have already noted, was characterized by systematic concealment and financial manipulation. But the contrast goes deeper than the mechanics of war finance. Imperial Germany mobilized its economy for war through a process that, while painful and disruptive, largely preserved the institutional fabric of German economic life. Companies continued to function as companies, banks continued to function as banks, labor unions, while subject to various wartime restrictions, continued to exist and represent their members. The social and institutional infrastructure of a complex modern economy was maintained through the war, damaged but intact, which is one reason why Germany was able to recover relatively quickly from the First World War's economic damage. Nazi Germany's war economy, by contrast, systematically destroyed many of the institutional foundations of a rational modern economy, replacing them with politically controlled allocation systems, slave labor, looting of occupied territories, and increasingly desperate improvisation as the military situation deteriorated. By 1945, the German economy was not merely damaged, it had been, in important respects, unmade. The role of air power in the two German wars provides another dimension through which the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two states can be assessed. Imperial Germany was an early pioneer of military aviation and employed aircraft for reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and fighter combat from very early in the First World War. German fighter pilots like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who scored 80 confirmed aerial victories before his death in April 1918, became legendary figures around whom an elaborate cult of heroic individual combat was constructed. Germany also pioneered the strategic bombing of civilian targets, deploying Zeppelin airships and later Gotha heavy bombers against British cities from 1915 onwards, killing hundreds of civilians and causing widespread panic, though the military effectiveness of these attacks was limited. By the end of the war, German aviation industry was producing aircraft in the thousands, and German fighter tactics and aircraft design, while no longer consistently ahead of Allied developments, remained competitive. The key point is that German air power in the First World War, while it never achieved decisive strategic effect, was managed as a coherent part of the overall military effort and developed in a rational relationship with the other services and with Germany's industrial capacity. When the German air service needed more aircraft, it placed orders with industry. When it needed more pilots, it trained them. When it identified tactical problems, it addressed them through doctrinal development. The system was imperfect, but it was a system. The Luftwaffe of the Second World War was, by comparison, a service blighted by institutional politics, doctrinal confusion, and chronic mismanagement at the highest levels. Its commander was Hermann Göring, a First World War fighter ace turned morphine addict and Nazi grandee, whose combination of political vanity, physical decay, and profound ignorance of the technical and organizational requirements of modern air warfare made him catastrophically unsuited for the position he held. Göring's repeated promises to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could accomplish things that were beyond its capacity, promises made to avoid political embarrassment rather than based on honest assessment of operational reality, led to a series of strategic disasters. He promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad by air, a commitment that required around 500 tons of supplies daily, and that the Luftwaffe never came close to delivering. He promised that the Luftwaffe could bomb Britain into submission in 1940. a campaign, the Battle of Britain, that the Luftwaffe fought without a coherent strategic plan, switching targets repeatedly and failing to press its early advantages against RAF airfields before turning to the indiscriminate bombing of London. He promised Hitler that no Allied bombs would fall on German soil, a promise that was rendered ridiculous by the first British bombing raids in 1940, and that made it politically impossible for him to acknowledge problems in German air defences until they had reached crisis proportions. The Luftwaffe was also, critically, designed as a tactical rather than a strategic instrument. Germany never developed a true heavy bomber capable of sustained strategic bombing operations of the kind conducted by the British and American air forces. Its aircraft were generally optimized for close support of ground forces and interdiction of enemy supply lines, functions they performed brilliantly in the early campaigns, but they lacked the range, payload, and navigation equipment needed to conduct sustained strategic air offensives against distant industrial targets. There is a deeper irony here that deserves to be highlighted. The Luftwaffe was, in the early years of the war, the most effective tactical air force in the world. German close air support tactics, developed during the Spanish Civil War and refined in Poland and France, were genuinely superior to those of any opponent until well into the war. The Stuka dive bomber, while it looked terrifying and sounded terrifying and was terrifying to soldiers in open ground with no air cover of their own, was actually a relatively slow and vulnerable aircraft that could only operate effectively under conditions of German air superiority. When Stukas met serious fighter opposition, as they did during the Battle of Britain in August 1940, they were shot down in large numbers and had to be withdrawn from the campaign. The fundamental vulnerability of Germany's tactical air power when stripped of air superiority prefigured the entire story of German military power in the later years of the war. Formidable when conditions were favourable, fragile when they were not, and lacking the depth and resilience to absorb the kind of sustained attrition that a long war against multiple industrial powers inevitably produced. Imperial Germany's air service, operating within more modest ambitions and with more limited resources, never promised more than it could deliver and never suffered the kind of catastrophic collapse of credibility that Göring's bombast produced. The Eastern Front of the Second World War provides the most dramatic and definitive illustration of the difference between Nazi Germany's apparent and actual strength. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it deployed 3.5 million men, nearly 4,000 tanks and 2,700 aircraft against the Soviet Union across a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The initial results were astonishing. In the first months of the IM campaign, the Wehrmacht destroyed multiple Soviet army groups, captured or killed millions of Soviet soldiers, and advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Battle of Kiev alone, completed in September 1941, resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, one of the largest encirclements in military history. By October 1941, German forces were within striking distance of Moscow, and the Soviet government had begun moving its ministries and archives to the east. To outside observers, the collapse of the Soviet Union seemed imminent, and yet it did not happen. And the reason it did not happen reveals something fundamental about the difference between Germany's surface military brilliance and its underlying strategic weakness. Imperial Germany, facing Russia in the First World War, fought a series of campaigns in the East that, by the standards of the Western Front, achieved remarkable results. The victories at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914 and early 1915 inflicted catastrophic losses on the Russian army. The Gorlice-Tarnow offensive of May 1915, a joint Austro-German operation, drove the Russians out of most of Galicia and Russian Poland in a campaign that demonstrated the superiority of German military organization and firepower over Russian equivalents. By 1917, the combination of military defeat, political revolution, and economic collapse had brought Russia to the point of total dissolution, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, imposed terms that were so punishing that they removed Russia from the war entirely, gave Germany control of Ukraine and the Baltic states, and freed over 1 million German soldiers for redeployment to the Western Front. Germany won the war in the East comprehensively and decisively. The fact that this victory came too late to affect the outcome in the West does not diminish its scale. It demonstrates that Imperial German military power was genuinely capable of defeating and destroying one of the world's great powers through sustained military operations over several years. Nazi Germany, for all the brilliance of Barbarossa's opening phase, failed to destroy the Soviet Union. The reasons for this failure are multiple and have been debated by historians for 8 decades, but several stand out as particularly relevant to our comparison. First, the ideological framework within which Barbarossa was planned meant that German operations were consistently distorted by racial preconceptions that had no basis in military reality. The assumption that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior and that the Soviet state would collapse quickly under sufficient military pressure led to planning that was reckless in its assumptions about supply, manpower, and the duration of the campaign. German logistics were completely inadequate for a campaign of the scale and duration that Barbarossa actually required. The Wehrmacht's supply system in 1941 was designed for the relatively short-distance campaigns of the Polish and French theatres. It was based on horse-drawn transport to a far greater degree than is commonly realised, with something like 600,000 horses deployed in support of Barbarossa alongside the more glamorous mechanised units. Rail gauge differences between German and Soviet lines required the conversion of hundreds of miles of Soviet track before German supply trains could use them. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the gates of Moscow in October 1941, its supply situation was, in the words of the German Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner, catastrophically bad. Second, and more fundamentally, the decision to conduct Barbarossa as an ideological war of racial annihilation, rather than as a conventional military campaign, profoundly damaged Germany's strategic position. The deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners, the mass murder of Jewish communities in occupied territories conducted by Einsatzgruppen following behind the advancing army, the treatment of Soviet civilians as racial inferiors to be exploited or eliminated rather than as potential allies against a Soviet regime that many of them genuinely hated, all of these policies had direct military consequences. They ensured that the populations of Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, many of whom had initially received German forces with at least cautious neutrality, became active supporters of Soviet resistance. They generated partisan movements that tied down hundreds of thousands of German security troops who could otherwise have been used at the front, and they ensured that the Soviet population, knowing what German occupation meant in practice, fought with a desperation that military calculations based on rational self-interest alone would not have predicted. Imperial Germany, fighting in the East in the First World War, did not conduct itself with perfect restraint. But its treatment of occupied populations was incomparably more humane than that of the Wehrmacht and the SS, and as a result it did not generate the same ferocious resistance that Nazi Germany faced everywhere its forces set foot. Third, the question of how Germany used the productive capacity of the territories it occupied illustrates a fundamental difference in strategic rationality between the two German states. Imperial Germany, occupying Belgium and northern France from 1914 onwards, systematically exploited these territories' industrial capacity for German war production. Belgian and French factories were made to produce goods for Germany. Belgian and French workers were employed in German-controlled enterprises. The exploitation was brutal and coercive, and it generated intense resentment, but it was at least economically rational. Germany was extracting productive value from the territories it controlled. Nazi Germany, occupying the Soviet Union from 1941, had the opportunity to do something similar with an enormous agricultural and industrial region. Instead, its occupation policies prioritized racial ideology over economic rationality, murdering skilled workers, destroying infrastructure in the course of military operations and subsequent looting, and in general treating the occupied Soviet territories as a zone of exploitation and extermination, rather than as a productive asset to be managed. The result was that Germany never effectively mobilized the resources of the territories it controlled in the East, resources that were, in aggregate, enormous. Ukraine alone, with its rich agricultural land and substantial industrial base, could theoretically have contributed massively to the German war effort under a rational occupation policy. Instead, it became a theatre of partisan warfare, mass murder, and economic devastation that consumed German resources rather than supplying them. The question of diplomatic and foreign policy effectiveness is another area in which Imperial Germany, despite ultimately losing its war, demonstrated considerably more sophistication and strategic coherence than the Nazi state. Otto von Bismarck, who had created the German Empire and served as its chancellor until 1890, was arguably the most skilled diplomatic practitioner of the 19th century. His system of alliances, designed to keep France isolated and prevent the formation of a coalition powerful enough to threaten Germany, was a masterpiece of strategic calculation. The reinsurance treaty with Russia, the triple alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy, the complex network of relationships Bismarck managed with extraordinary skill was the product of a statesman who understood that Germany's central position in Europe made it vulnerable to encirclement, and that its long-term security depended on preventing the formation of precisely the kind of Anglo-French-Russian coalition that eventually destroyed it. Bismarck's successors in the Wilhelmina era, particularly Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellors, abandoned this diplomatic framework with reckless haste, allowing the reinsurance treaty to lapse, antagonizing Britain with the naval building program, and generally behaving in ways that confirmed other powers' fears of German hegemonic ambitions. The result was the triple entente of Britain, France, and Russia that Germany faced in 1914. But even so, German diplomacy in 1914 to 1918, though it had created the strategic situation it faced, at least operated within recognizable diplomatic conventions, maintained useful relationships with neutral countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands, and attempted, however clumsily and unsuccessfully, to use diplomatic means alongside military ones to achieve its objectives. Hitler's diplomacy was of an entirely different character. It was, in the early years of his rule, brilliantly successful precisely because it operated through deception, exploiting the reluctance of the Western powers to risk another war, and their genuine uncertainty about whether his demands were limited or unlimited. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the incorporation of the Sudetenland following the Munich Agreement of September 1938, the occupation of the Rump Czech state in March 1939, all of these were diplomatic coups that expanded German territory and strategic position without triggering the military response that they objectively warranted. But this success rested entirely on the willingness of Britain and France to appease. And once that willingness ran out with the British guarantee to Poland in March 1939, Hitler's diplomatic approach proved to have a fundamental structural weakness. It could not accommodate any outcome other than German victory, because it was not, at bottom, a diplomatic strategy at all. It was a strategy of domination that used diplomatic language until it became unnecessary. When Germany found itself at war with Britain and France after September 1939, it had no coherent plan for ending that war on terms that Britain and France could accept, because any terms they could accept would leave them as sovereign states capable of eventually recovering the power to challenge German dominance. Hitler wanted not peace with Britain, but Britain's capitulation, and he was never able to offer terms attractive enough to produce it. His attempts to maintain good relations with Japan while also keeping the United States out of the war were equally incoherent, since Japan's expansionism in East Asia and the Pacific made American neutrality increasingly untenable, regardless of German policy choices, and his decision to declare war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, brought the full industrial power of America into the European conflict, in exchange for no military advantage whatsoever, since the Tripartite Pact did not actually require Germany to support Japan's Pacific War. It was, as the historian Gerhard Weinberg has noted, possibly the single worst diplomatic decision of the entire war, made apparently on the basis of Hitler's personal contempt for American military capability and his desire to support his Japanese allies with no systematic analysis of what it would mean for Germany's strategic position. The comparison of how the two German states handled neutrals during their respective wars is also revealing. Imperial Germany in the First World War was remarkably adept at maintaining useful relationships with neutral countries and at exploiting their geography for its own purposes. Sweden supplied Germany with iron ore throughout most of the war, a critical contribution to German steel production. Switzerland, while genuinely neutral, provided banking and financial services that helped Germany manage its international financial relationships despite the Allied blockade. Romania, initially neutral, was courted by both sides and eventually joined the Allies in 1916, but Germany managed to defeat Romanian forces so quickly and comprehensively that the country's oil fields at Ploesti were captured and put to German use within months of Romania's entry into the war. Even the Ottoman Empire's entry as a German ally, which brought strategic complications of its own, was the product of active German diplomacy that succeeded in detaching the Ottomans from their traditional posture of cautious neutrality. Nazi Germany's handling of neutral countries was, by comparison, considerably less skilled. The pressure applied to Switzerland, Sweden, Spain and Portugal for economic concessions and political compliance frequently went far enough to generate resentment and passive resistance, without going far enough to produce actual compliance. Franco's Spain, which Hitler had helped bring to power during the Civil War through the intervention of the Condor Legion, declined to enter the war on Germany's side despite Hitler's famous personal appeal at their meeting at Hendaye in October 1940, a meeting at which Franco's demands for territorial compensation were so extensive that Hitler reportedly said he would rather have 3 or 4 teeth pulled out than go through another meeting with the Spanish dictator. Turkey similarly managed to remain neutral despite enormous German and Allied pressure throughout most of the war. These were not necessarily Germany's fault, since every great power in history has had to deal with the inconvenient sovereignty of smaller states. But Germany's relative inability to translate its military dominance of Europe in the years 1940 to 1942 into a sustainable political and economic order that neutral countries would voluntarily participate in reflected the fundamental illegitimacy of the Nazi New Order in European eyes. The human cost of the 2 German wars, measured not just in German military casualties, but in the total human suffering caused by German state action, represents the most morally significant dimension of any comparison between the 2 periods. Imperial Germany was responsible for enormous suffering. The German invasion of Belgium in August 1914, which the German High Command had planned as a violation of Belgian neutrality that they expected to accomplish quickly, and that they hoped the British would accept as a fait accompli, involved the killing of several thousand Belgian civilians in the so-called Rape of Belgium, a series of atrocities against civilian populations that provoked international outrage. German submarine warfare in the unrestricted campaigns of 1917 killed thousands of sailors and civilians, including those aboard passenger vessels like the Lusitania in May 1915, whose sinking killed nearly 1,200 people, including many American citizens. German artillery destroyed the medieval centres of cities like Ypres, Leuven and Reims. German occupation of Belgium and northern France involved systematic economic exploitation, forced labour, and reprisals against civilian resistance. By any reasonable moral standard, Germany's conduct in the First World War was deeply troubling in many respects, and yet it bears no comparison whatsoever to the scale and character of Germany's actions in the Second World War. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jewish people of Europe, carried out between 1941 and 1945 through a combination of shooting, gassing, starvation, and deliberate exposure, is the most monstrous crime in European and possibly world history. It was not an accidental byproduct of the war. It was planned, organised, and carried out by the German state and its willing collaborators with the same administrative thoroughness that the state brought to railway timetabling or census-taking. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the implementation of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, was organised by Reinhard Heydrich with the administrative efficiency of a government planning meeting, which is exactly what it was. The murder of the Jews was conducted simultaneously with the murder of hundreds of thousands of Roma, the systematic killing of Soviet prisoners, the murder of the handicapped through the T4 euthanasia program, the persecution and murder of homosexuals, political opponents, and others defined as enemies of the racial state. The total death toll of people murdered by the Nazi regime and its collaborators, excluding those killed in conventional military operations, runs into the tens of millions. This is a dimension of German action in the Second World War that has no parallel in the First. Imperial Germany, for all its militarism and aggression, did not operate extermination camps. It did not implement a program for the biological elimination of entire peoples. The Holocaust was not an intensification of something that had existed before in German history. It was something genuinely new and uniquely terrible, made possible by the ideological character of the Nazi state and the particular combination of bureaucratic modernity and moral collapse that it embodied. The strategic implications of the Holocaust for Germany's war effort are themselves revealing. The diversion of transport, manpower, and organizational resources to the murder of Europe's Jewish communities was not cost-free in military terms. Railway capacity that might have been used to supply the Eastern Front was used to transport Jews to the death camps in Poland. SS manpower that might have reinforced the Wehrmacht was used to staff the concentration camp system. Administrative energy that might have been devoted to more rational exploitation of occupied territories was spent planning and implementing mass murder. The idea sometimes encountered in popular history that the Holocaust was somehow separate from the military conflict and had no effect on Germany's strategic position is contradicted by the evidence. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoir, claimed to have been unaware of the Holocaust while armaments minister, a claim that most historians now regard as false, but his description of the bureaucratic and resource conflicts within the Nazi system makes clear that the murder program competed directly with the war economy for resources. Eichmann's organization, which coordinated the deportation of Jews from occupied Europe to the death camps, operated as a separate bureaucratic empire with its own trains, its own guards, its own planning systems, running in parallel with and sometimes in direct conflict with the requirements of military production and supply. The deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, involving the movement of hundreds of thousands of people at a moment when the Wehrmacht desperately needed every available train for military supply in the face of the Soviet summer offensive, is one of the clearest examples of how ideological obsession overrode strategic rationality in the Nazi state. Imperial Germany committed no analogous acts of self-sabotage. The question of how each German state dealt with military failure is another dimension that reveals fundamental structural differences. Imperial Germany, facing a succession of crises and reverses, demonstrated a notable ability to adapt, reform, and rebuild. After the failure to achieve the quick victory promised by the Schlieffen Plan in 1914, Germany adapted to the unexpected demands of a prolonged, two-front war with considerable competence. The development of the Hindenburg Line defensive system in the West in 1916 and 1917, which shortened German lines, freed manpower for other theatres, and created a defensive position of genuine depth and sophistication, was a brilliant piece of military engineering that reflected institutional learning at the highest level. The development of new infiltration tactics in 1917 and 1918, after 3 years of failed attempts at breakthrough by mass assault, reflected a German army that was capable of looking honestly at what was not working and developing alternatives. The reforms of the Hindenburg Programme in 1916, which reorganized the entire war economy on a more rational basis, reflected at least a capacity for genuine institutional self-criticism and adaptation. Germany in the First World War was not inflexible. It learned, adapted, and reformed throughout the conflict, even as the overall strategic trajectory moved against it. Nazi Germany's institutional response to military failure was almost the precise opposite. Rather than adapting and reforming in response to evidence of what was not working, the Nazi system responded to failure by looking for scapegoats, by imposing more rigorous ideological conformity, and by increasing the violence of its demands on soldiers and civilians alike. When the blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so brilliantly in 1939 and 1940 failed to produce a quick victory in the Soviet Union, Hitler did not commission a systematic study of what had gone wrong and how tactics and strategy should be adjusted. He dismissed or ignored the generals who told him the truth about the military situation and doubled down on the same approach that had failed. When German forces suffered catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad, at Kursk, and in Normandy, the response was not rational analysis, but intensified terror, more elaborate scapegoating, and increasingly delusional planning for counter-offensives that the Wehrmacht no longer had the strength to execute. By 1944, German military planning had become divorced from operational reality to a degree that would have been diagnosed as clinical delusion if it had appeared in an individual patient. Hitler's insistence on the existence of fictional army groups, his orders to divisions that had ceased to exist, his demands for counterattacks that had no basis in the actual distribution of available forces. These were not the product of a rational, if desperate, strategic mind. They were the product of a political system that had spent 12 years systematically punishing anyone who contradicted the leader's wishes, with the predictable result that by the end the leader was receiving no reliable information about reality at all. The broader historical significance of this comparison extends well beyond the specific events of two world wars. What the contrast between Imperial and Nazi Germany actually illustrates is a fundamental truth about the relationship between political systems and military effectiveness. Rational military power requires rational political structures. It requires institutions that can process information honestly and transmit it upward to decision-makers without systematic distortion. It requires leaders who are willing to hear unwelcome truths and to adjust their plans accordingly. It requires administrative systems that allocate resources on the basis of genuine strategic need, rather than political favoritism or ideological prejudice. It requires the ability to mobilize and use human talent regardless of the racial, religious, or political characteristics of the individuals who possess that talent. And it requires war aims that are, at least in principle, achievable through negotiated settlement, so that the option of ending the conflict on acceptable terms remains available if the military situation deteriorates beyond the point where continued fighting can be justified. Imperial Germany satisfied many, though by no means all, of these requirements. Nazi Germany satisfied essentially none of them. And this is why, despite its initial military successes that seemed to announce a new era of German dominance, Hitler's Reich ultimately proved to be not the fulfillment of German military power, but its catastrophic perversion. The post-war contrast between the two Germanys offers a final, powerful piece of evidence for this argument. Imperial Germany was defeated in 1918, but it was not destroyed. The German state, its institutions, its industry, and its professional culture survived the First World War in sufficient condition that Germany was able to recover its economic position with remarkable speed during the 1920s, reach agreements with its former enemies through the Locarno Treaties of 1925, and rejoin the international community as a respected participant in the League of Nations by 1926. The damage done to German society by the First World War was enormous, but the institutional fabric of German civic life, the universities, the churches, the professional organizations, the legal system, the tradition of local self-government survived broadly intact. It was precisely this surviving institutional fabric that Hitler was able to exploit in his seizure of power, turning Germany's functioning state apparatus to his own purposes. Nazi Germany, by contrast, was not merely defeated, but effectively destroyed. The Second World War ended with Germany divided between four occupying powers, its industrial heartland devastated by bombing and ground combat, its governmental structure dismantled, its educational and cultural institutions having been so thoroughly corrupted by 12 years of ideological control that they required fundamental reconstruction, and its population carrying a burden of guilt and shame for the crimes committed in its name that would take generations to begin to process. Germany recovered from these conditions too, eventually and impressively, but it did so under American occupation and with American economic support through the Marshall Plan, in conditions that were entirely dependent on the political choices of its former enemies. The recovery from the First World War had been the achievement of German society acting primarily on its own resources. The recovery from the Second World War was possible only through the generosity of the very nations that Germany had sought to destroy. To understand the full dimensions of Nazi Germany's relative weakness compared to its imperial predecessor, it is worth looking in detail at some specific case studies where the contrast is most dramatic and most instructive. The management of the German armoured force provides one of the most illuminating examples. The theory of armoured warfare that produced the devastating victories of 1939 and 1940 was developed in the interwar period by a relatively small group of visionary officers. Most notably Heinz Guderian, whose book Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, laid out the principles of combined arms mechanized warfare that became the foundation of Blitzkrieg. These principles drew explicitly on the infantry infiltration tactics of the First World War and adapted them for the era of tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support, creating a form of warfare that could penetrate enemy defenses, bypass strong points, and exploit breakthroughs with a speed that left enemy command and control unable to respond effectively. In the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, when German forces faced opponents who were still thinking. In terms of the relatively static attritional warfare of the previous war, these tactics were devastating. The collapse of France in 6 weeks against an opponent that actually had more tanks and artillery than Germany was the most dramatic demonstration of how superior doctrine and operational method could overcome material inferiority. But here is the thing that most popular accounts of the Second World War fail to emphasize sufficiently. The armoured force that achieved these victories was, by the standards that would prevail later in the war, a relatively small and modestly equipped instrument. Germany had around 2,500 tanks for the invasion of France in May 1940, most of them light vehicles armed with machine guns or small caliber cannon that would have been destroyed in seconds by even the medium tanks that both sides were fielding by 1943. The famous Panzer III, which was the standard German tank of the 1940 campaign, mounted a 37mm gun that was already marginal against contemporary armour. The Panzer IV, which was to become the workhorse of German armoured forces throughout the war, existed in only small numbers in 1940 and was armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun designed for infantry support rather than tank combat. The German victory in France was achieved not because Germany had better tanks than its opponents, but because it used the tanks it had with far greater tactical and operational skill. Britain and France together fielded more tanks than Germany for the French campaign, including several types that were significantly better armoured and armed than anything Germany had. The British Matilda II, for example, was effectively immune to most German anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges, and gave German tank commanders genuine problems whenever they encountered it. What Germany lacked in material quality, it more than compensated for through superior doctrine, superior communication, and superior leadership. This triumph of skill over material, which was the true achievement of the early Wehrmacht, was something that Imperial Germany had also demonstrated repeatedly. The victories at Tannenberg, at the Masurian Lakes, in Galicia, in Romania, and on the Western Front in March 1918 all reflected a German military culture that placed a premium on officer quality, on tactical initiative, and on the ability to maintain the tempo of operations when opponents' command structures were paralysed by the speed of events. The connection between the two eras is direct. Many of the senior officers who led the Wehrmacht in 1939 and 1940 had served as junior officers in the First World War and had learned their trade in its campaigns. Guderian himself had served as a communications officer in the war and had drawn directly on his wartime experience in developing his armoured warfare theories. Erich von Manstein had been a young staff officer and had personally observed the 1918 offensive that had come closest to breaking the Allied line. The Wehrmacht of the early war was, in this important sense, the direct institutional heir of the Imperial Army at its finest, inheriting its best traditions and building on them with the new technologies of mechanized warfare. The tragedy, from a purely military perspective, is how completely and how quickly this inheritance was squandered. By 1942, the Wehrmacht was facing opponents who had had time to study German methods, to develop their own versions of mechanized warfare doctrine, and to begin producing tanks and aircraft in quantities that Germany could not match. The Soviet T-34, when it appeared in significant numbers in 1941 and 1942, gave German tank crews genuine nightmares. Its sloped armour, its wide tracks, its powerful diesel engine, and its 76mm gun combined qualities of protection, mobility, and firepower that no German tank in service could match until the Tiger and Panther entered production in 1942 and 1943. But here is the problem. Germany produced approximately 8,000 Tiger tanks in total during the entire war. The Soviet Union produced over 80,000 T-34s. The Tiger was in many respects a superior vehicle in individual combat. But individual combat is not how wars are decided when one side can replace its losses and the other cannot. The emphasis on quality over quantity in German tank production reflected a cultural preference for excellence that was admirable in peacetime and disastrous in war. Imperial Germany, facing similar challenges of material inferiority against the combined resources of the Entente, had at least attempted to address the problem through the Hindenburg programme's emphasis on mass production of standardized equipment. Nazi Germany's equivalent, Albert Speer's armaments rationalization, came too late and never achieved the standardization that would have maximized German productive efficiency. The air war offers an equally instructive case study. The Luftwaffe that went to war in September 1939 was a formidable instrument, but it rested on doctrinal and organizational foundations that were less solid than they appeared. The Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 exposed these weaknesses with brutal clarity. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, based around the excellent Messerschmitt Bf 109, was in terms of aircraft quality broadly comparable to the RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires. But the Bf 109 had a range limitation that severely constrained its operational effectiveness over Britain. Operating from bases in northern France, it could spend only about 30 minutes over London before its fuel forced it to turn back, leaving German bombers to face RAF fighters without adequate protection. This was a fundamental operational flaw that was a direct consequence of the Luftwaffe's design as a tactical rather than strategic air force. Nobody had planned for a campaign requiring long-range fighter escort, so no aircraft capable of providing it existed. The result was that German bomber losses in the Battle of Britain quickly reached unsustainable levels, forcing the abandonment of daylight precision bombing in favour of night attacks that were inaccurate and strategically futile. Germany lost the Battle of Britain, and with it, any realistic prospect of invading Britain in 1940, partly because of pilot skill and RAF bravery, certainly, but also because the Luftwaffe was being asked to perform a mission for which it had not been designed and for which its equipment was inadequate. An air force that had been conceived and built by men who understood strategic air power, as the British and American air forces were, would have included long-range fighters and heavy bombers, as a matter of course. The contrast with Germany's performance in the First World War is telling. In that conflict, Germany fought the air war with the forces it actually had, pursuing achievable objectives, the interdiction of Allied supply lines, the defence of German forces from aerial observation, the provision of close support to ground operations rather than making extravagant promises that outstripped its actual capabilities. The German air service in the First World War never promised to win the war through air power alone, because its leaders understood that it was a relatively new and still limited instrument. The Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief in the Second World War made exactly such promises repeatedly, with consequences that we have already noted. The German Navy's trajectory in the two wars also illustrates the broader pattern. The German surface fleet, built at such expense in the decades before 1914 to challenge British naval supremacy, was bottled up in port for most of the First World War after Jutland demonstrated that it could not defeat the Royal Navy in open battle. This was a strategic failure of the First Order. The fleet consumed enormous resources in construction and maintenance, but delivered no strategic return commensurate with its cost. The unrestricted submarine campaign, by contrast, came genuinely close to achieving strategic results, bringing Britain to the edge of a supply crisis that might have forced it out of the war if the convoy system had not been adopted in time. The lesson that Germany should have drawn from this experience was clear. Submarines, not surface ships, were the instrument of German naval strategy. Admiral Karl Dönitz drew this lesson with complete clarity, arguing throughout the interwar period that a fleet of 300 ocean-going submarines would, if deployed from the beginning of a new war, be capable of severing Britain's Atlantic supply lines before effective countermeasures could be developed. He was probably right, but he never got his 300 submarines. Germany entered the Second World War with 27 ocean-going U-boats, a fraction of what was needed because the surface fleet lobby and the political attractions of impressive-looking battleships had absorbed the bulk of available naval construction resources. The Zeedeplan that would eventually have given Germany a balanced fleet capable of challenging British sea power was still years from completion when the war began. The Navy of the Second World War was thus caught in a strategic dilemma from the very beginning. Its surface ships were individually impressive, but collectively too few and too vulnerable to contest the seas effectively, while its submarine arm, which was its real strategic instrument, had too few boats to deliver the decisive results that Dönitz's analysis suggested were possible. The comparison between the two German states must also address the question of what each was actually trying to achieve, and whether those objectives were, in principle, achievable. This is not merely a question of ethics, though the ethical dimensions are obviously enormous. It is a question of strategic rationality. Imperial Germany's war aims, as we have discussed, were expansionist and aggressive, but not entirely irrational in the context of great power competition as it had been practiced for the previous century. Germany wanted a larger colonial empire, greater security on its eastern border, and recognition as a power of the first rank. These were the kinds of objectives that, in a world organized around competition between sovereign states, could theoretically be achieved and sustained. The world had seen in the recent past examples of successful territorial expansion and imperial consolidation by great powers that had not led to permanent destabilization. Germany's aims were, in this sense, continuous with a recognizable tradition of great power behavior, however much one might condemn that tradition. Hitler's aims were different in kind, not just in degree. The Lebensraum program, the plan for German racial settlement of Eastern Europe, required not merely the defeat of the Soviet Union, but its permanent dissolution, the elimination or subjugation of its Slavic population, and the colonization of its territory by German settlers over a period of generations. This was not merely aggressive. It was, in any realistic assessment, impossible. The Soviet Union contained nearly 200 million people in 1941. Even if Hitler's armies had achieved the complete military destruction of the Red Army and the capture of Moscow, Leningrad, and all the major Soviet cities, the idea that a German empire of 80 million people, with a European population largely exhausted by years of war, could have colonized and controlled a territory of that size against the inevitable resistance of its population, was a fantasy with no basis in practical reality. The Spanish had failed to hold the Americas with far less determined resistance. The British Empire, at the height of its power, had found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over far smaller territories against nationalist movements. The notion that Germany could permanently colonize and control an area stretching from the Vistula to the Urals was a racial delusion of the most dangerous kind, one that drove Germany into a war it could not sustainably win, even if it achieved its initial military objectives. Imperial Germany, for all its aggression, was at least fighting for objectives that were, in principle, sustainable if achieved. Nazi Germany was fighting for objectives that were strategically impossible, regardless of military outcomes. The question of why Nazi Germany appeared so overwhelmingly strong in its early years, when it was in fact fundamentally weaker than its imperial predecessor, deserves careful examination, because the answer reveals something important about the relationship between tactical brilliance and strategic depth. The early victories of the Second World War, Poland in 1939, France in 1940, Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, the initial phase of Barbarossa in 1941 were achieved by a military machine that was genuinely superior to its opponents in doctrine, leadership, and morale. But these opponents were either small countries with limited military resources or larger powers that had been caught in the process of reforming and re-equipping their armed forces, or that were facing Germany before the enormous productive capacity of the United States had been mobilized for war. The speed and decisiveness of German victories in this period created the illusion of invincibility that led Hitler and many observers both inside and outside Germany to conclude that Germany was indeed the master of modern warfare and that no coalition of powers could defeat it. This was the most dangerous conclusion possible because it encouraged the extension of the war to theatres and against opponents that Germany was not equipped to defeat. Had Germany's victories been slower and more costly, they might have prompted a more realistic assessment of German strategic limitations. Instead, they confirmed Hitler in the delusional belief that willpower and tactical superiority could substitute for the industrial depth, the rational political organization, and the sustainable war aims that genuine strategic power requires. The final chapter of the Second World War, the period from the failure before Moscow in December 1941 to Germany's surrender in May 1945, is in one sense the story of how the structural weaknesses that were always present in the Nazi military machine became impossible to conceal or compensate for as the war extended and the full productive power of the Allied coalition was brought to bear. Soviet industrial output, which had been grievously disrupted by the German advance in 1941, recovered with astonishing speed to outproduce Germany in tanks, artillery and aircraft by the end of 1942, and to increase that margin dramatically in 1943 and 1944. American Lend-Lease, which supplied the Soviet Union with hundreds of thousands of trucks, dozens of railway locomotives, millions of pairs of boots, millions of tons of food, and thousands of aircraft and vehicles, solved the logistics and supply problems that had crippled Soviet operations in 1941, and freed Soviet industry to concentrate on the weapons of direct combat. British and American bombing, which began to reach strategic effect in 1943 and 1944, progressively dismantled the industrial infrastructure on which German war production depended, targeting synthetic oil plants, railway marshalling yards, aircraft factories, and armaments production facilities with increasing accuracy and effectiveness. By early 1945, Germany was losing the equivalent of its entire monthly tank production every few weeks to combat attrition, with no prospect of replacement. Imperial Germany, in the autumn and winter of 1918, faced a deteriorating military situation that, while serious, was not as comprehensively hopeless as Germany's situation in early 1945. The army that broke and retreated after the Allied offensives of August and September 1918 was exhausted, demoralized and outmatched in material terms, but it was still a coherent military force conducting a fighting withdrawal. Germany's cities were not being systematically destroyed from the air. Its industrial production, while strained, had not been comprehensively disrupted. The territory of Germany itself had not been invaded. In November 1918, when the armistice was signed, not a single Allied soldier stood on German soil. This is one of the reasons why the myth of the stab in the back, the idea that Germany's undefeated army had been betrayed by civilian leaders who surrendered unnecessarily, was able to gain such traction in the following years, exploited most fatally by Hitler himself. Whatever you think of this legend, and it is historically false, it was at least psychologically intelligible, given the military situation when the armistice was signed. There was no comparable myth available to the survivors of the Second World War. By May 1945, Soviet, American, British and other Allied forces occupied every significant German city. The last pockets of German resistance were scattered remnants, cut off from each other and from any coherent command structure, fighting not from military necessity but from habit, fear of retribution, and the desperate hope that the impending collapse would spare them and their families from the worst. Germany in 1945 was not merely defeated. It was comprehensively, categorically and demonstrably annihilated as a military power. There is one more comparison worth making, a comparison that brings the entire argument into its sharpest focus. How did each German state deal with the prospect of defeat, and what did the manner of their endings tell us about their fundamental characters? Imperial Germany in October and November 1918, facing military defeat and social revolution, negotiated an armistice through the legitimate channels of international diplomacy and handed power from the military to a civilian government in a process that, while traumatic and contested, preserved the basic institutional continuity of the German state. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and went into exile in the Netherlands, where he lived peacefully until 1941. The new government, which became the Weimar Republic, immediately began the process of attempting to rebuild German society within the framework of democratic institutions and international law. The transition from war to peace, however painful, was managed through recognizable political processes that allowed Germany to remain a functioning state capable of eventual recovery. Nazi Germany, by contrast, fought to the absolute limit of its capacity and beyond, sacrificing its own people in their hundreds of thousands in a final defense of a system whose leaders had long since given up any realistic hope of victory. Berlin in April 1945 was defended by improvised units of teenagers and elderly men in a battle that destroyed what remained of one of Europe's great cities and killed tens of thousands of people who had no realistic prospect of affecting the outcome. Hitler died by suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, not before issuing orders for the destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure in the Nero Decree, directing that bridges, factories, railway lines and power plants be demolished to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. His intention was, literally, to destroy Germany rather than see it survive in a form that would survive him. that a leader who claimed to embody the German national spirit could countenance the deliberate destruction of the country he ruled reveals, more starkly than any economic statistic or military comparison, the fundamental difference between a state that, however aggressively, pursued recognizable national interests and a state that had become an instrument of one man's apocalyptic will. The legacy of the comparison between Imperial and Nazi Germany resonates in important ways for how we think about military power, political organization, and the relationship between ideology and strategic effectiveness. The First World War demonstrated that Imperial Germany, despite its military culture, its economic strength, and its institutional competence, could not ultimately overcome the combined resources of the British Empire, France, Russia, and eventually the United States, fighting simultaneously on multiple fronts. It also demonstrated that a state can fight effectively and rationally over a sustained period, even in the face of overwhelming material disadvantage, provided its political and military institutions are functioning adequately. The Second World War demonstrated something additional, that ideological obsession, political dysfunction, institutional chaos, and the systematic subordination of rational calculation to the will of a single deranged leader can take a country that starts from a position of genuine military strength and turn it into an instrument of self-destruction of almost unparalleled completeness. Nazi Germany did not lose the Second World War because it was outfought at the tactical level. In many respects, its soldiers and airmen and sailors fought with extraordinary skill and courage until the very end. It lost because the political system that directed their efforts was incapable of the sustained rational calculation, the diplomatic flexibility, the economic coherence, and the moral restraint that sustained military effectiveness over time requires. It is tempting, and in some circles fashionable, to regard Nazi Germany's defeat as having been inevitable from the beginning, to see it as the foreordained outcome of a confrontation between a relatively small nation pursuing insane objectives and a coalition that commanded the vast majority of the world's industrial resources. And there is truth in this view. Germany was never going to defeat simultaneously the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. But it is worth remembering that Imperial Germany came genuinely, startlingly close to winning the First World War, and that country faced a coalition that was, in aggregate, comparably powerful. The difference was not primarily one of material resources, though those certainly mattered. The difference was one of political rationality. Imperial Germany, fighting for achievable objectives through rational means with professional institutions and professional leadership, came within touching distance of victory. Nazi Germany, fighting for unachievable objectives through irrational means with dysfunctional institutions and catastrophic leadership, never had a realistic prospect of ultimate victory after the first months of the war revealed that the Soviet Union was not going to collapse on schedule. This is what it means to say that Hitler's Germany was weaker than the Kaiser's, not that it lacked soldiers or weapons or industrial capacity in the short term, but that the political system that directed those assets was incapable of using them in a way that could produce sustainable strategic success, because it was, at its core, a system built not around the national interest of the German people, but around the personal will and ideological obsessions of one man, and that man was, by any rational measure, not remotely equipped to lead a major power in a global war. The specific figures and statistics that underpin this argument deserve a final review because they are striking enough to bear repetition. Germany in 1914 had a population of 67 million people and produced around 17 million tons of steel per year, more than Britain and France combined. Germany in 1939 had a population of 80 million people, including the annexed Austrians and Sudeten Germans, and produced over 22 million tons of steel. In terms of raw numbers, Nazi Germany was larger and more productive than Imperial Germany. And yet it lost a war that its predecessor came within a whisker of winning. The United States produced over 80 million tons of steel in 1944 alone, more than twice Germany's entire wartime output. The Soviet Union, despite losing perhaps 40% of its industrial capacity to German occupation in 1941 and 1942, produced over 30,000 tanks in 1943 compared to Germany's 17,000. Britain, smaller than Germany in population and industrial capacity, outproduced it in aircraft throughout most of the war. These figures tell a story not of German industrial weakness, but of German strategic overextension. A country that picked simultaneous fights with the world's three leading industrial powers had, in the most literal sense, bitten off more than it could chew. Imperial Germany's strategic situation had been comparably challenging, but it had at least built its coalition and its war aims in ways that made the challenge marginally more manageable. Nazi Germany's diplomatic blundering managed to assemble the most powerful coalition in human history against it with a thoroughness that bordered on strategic genius in reverse. The historians who have grappled most seriously with these questions, men like Richard Evans, Ian Kershaw, Adam Tooze, Gerhard Weinberg and John Keegan, have each in their own way contributed to our understanding of how a country of Germany's genuine capabilities could have been led into such a catastrophic strategic position. Adam Tooze's brilliant economic history of the Nazi war economy, The Wages of Destruction, demonstrates with meticulous precision how Germany's economic planners understood perfectly well that their country could not sustain a long war against the combined resources of Britain and America, let alone with the Soviet Union added to the list, and how Hitler's response to this understanding was not to moderate his ambitions, but to attempt to win decisively before the material balance became overwhelming. The gamble on a quick victory in the East in 1941 was not irrational given this analysis. What was irrational was the racial ideology that shaped the planning for that campaign in ways that maximized the probability of failure. Ian Kershaw's monumental two-volume biography of Hitler demonstrates how the Führer's leadership style progressively dismantled the institutional competence of the German state, replacing professional judgment with personal loyalty as the criterion for advancement and creating decision-making processes that were increasingly detached from military reality. Gerhard Weinberg's comprehensive study of the war's global dimensions shows how Hitler's diplomatic decisions, particularly the declaration of war on the United States in December 1941, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial and military potential that would have been corrected by even the most basic professional assessment of the available evidence. Each of these scholarly perspectives converges on the same fundamental conclusion. Nazi Germany was weaker than Imperial Germany not because it lacked industrial capacity or military skill, but because its political system was incapable of deploying either in a strategically coherent and sustainable manner. There is a final irony worth noting. The German army that fought the Second World War, despite operating under political direction that was increasingly deranged and that ultimately ensured its defeat, produced military professionals whose operational skills were, in many respects, the finest in the world. German generals like Manstein, Guderian and Rommel demonstrated tactical and operational brilliance that has been studied in military academies around the world ever since. German junior officers and non-commissioned officers operating under the Auftragstaktik system that they had inherited from the imperial tradition consistently outperformed their counterparts in other armies at every level of tactical command. German soldiers in individual and small unit actions throughout the war fought with extraordinary skill and tenacity that imposed disproportionate losses on their opponents right to the very end. The Wehrmacht's loss ratio, measuring casualties inflicted against casualties suffered, was, in most theatres and most periods of the war, consistently favourable to Germany. Germany killed more enemy soldiers per German soldier killed than any other major power in the conflict. And yet, Germany lost, utterly and completely, because tactical brilliance and operational skill, however genuinely impressive, cannot compensate for strategic incoherence, economic miscalculation, and ideological madness at the level of political leadership. This is perhaps the most important lesson that the comparison between Imperial and Nazi Germany offers to anyone who thinks seriously about the nature of military power and the relationship between political organization and strategic effectiveness. When you watch footage of the Nazi war machine in its early triumphant phase, the armoured columns rolling across the plains of France, the Stuka dive bombers screaming toward their targets, the vast parades in Nuremberg with their carefully choreographed display of power, it is easy to see why so many contemporaries believed they were watching the most formidable military force in human history. And in a narrow tactical sense, they were not entirely wrong. But the footage that tells the true story is the footage from the other end of the war. The ruins of Stalingrad in February 1943, the destroyed armoured columns around the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, the bombed-out shell of Berlin in April 1945. Imperial Germany, defeated in November 1918, left Germany's cities standing and its institutions functioning. Nazi Germany, defeated in May 1945, left behind a continent in ruins and a moral catastrophe of dimensions that the world had never previously experienced and has not experienced since. The measure of military power is not what a state can achieve in its best moments, but what it can sustain over time and at what cost. By that measure, Hitler's Germany was not merely weaker than the Kaiser's. It was, in every dimension that truly matters, an inferior civilization attempting to impose itself on a world that had, fortunately, and at enormous cost, the resources and the determination to resist it. Well, that is it for today. If you found this analysis compelling, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Hitler's Germany's top field marshals after World War II, where we explore what became of the men who actually commanded Germany's armies when the Third Reich finally collapsed, and our video on Where Did the Waffen-SS Go After 1945, which looks at how Hitler's most fanatical soldiers attempted to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the history of the Second World War. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.